lot of people getting into trouble out here because I don't think they realize kind of what it takes to actually survive in this environment when they're out there.
Howdy, folks, and welcome to the Daily Coin. My name is Rory, and we have on the line today Mr. Rob Richardson that operates offgridsurvival.com, and he has recently published the Ultimate Situational Survival Guide, Self-Reliant Strategies for a Dangerous World. How you doing, Rob?
Hey, pretty good, Rory. Thanks for having me on.
Well, all right. Well, let's jump in and see what happens.
All right, sounds good.
All right. We're not talking about something that, that you can willy-nilly through. I mean, if there's, and it's something like a no-knock raid. I mean, how would a person, how would you, Rob, how would you deal with a no-knock raid? What would be something that would be helpful to people to understand about something of that type of a situation?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just kind of understanding that happens. I don't think a lot of people even have a grasp that, that's something that happens out there right now. I mean, that's a scary thing. And it's hard to tell people how to prepare for something like that because, I mean, what do you do? Because on one hand, that happens. You see a lot of this stuff happening 4, 5, 6 in the morning when people are still in bed. And, something like that happens. How do you know if it's, either a home invader or if it is the police coming in there? I mean, so that's a difficult one to tell people how to prepare for.
It is a difficult one. It's a difficult situation. And what recently happened is that a homeowner who was the recipient of a no-knock raid actually killed at least one police officer. And he survived the situation, but there are people that are dead over it because they were breaking into his home. And it's amazing. I mean, just this past week, there was another no-knock raid, flash bomb in an infant's bed. I mean, and that's 2 within the last, 3 months or so, right around 3 months. That's unacceptable.
Yeah, it's a scary thing because I'm seeing the same thing where you're seeing a lot of these things where it's either the wrong address, somebody, a random family member that either used to live there or, they seen the same last name, so they start coming after you. Or you've got there's that new trend they call swatting where people are calling in, kind of fake information just to get back at someone. And that's a scary situation you have there.
That's I'm not familiar with that. Swatting.
Yeah,
wow.
I think it started with a lot of these celebrities where people were calling in bogus reports of like kidnappings or just random crimes where you'd have these SWAT teams showing up at celebrities' houses and people were doing it as kind of pranks. I think some of them started on radio shows and stuff like that. But I've seen stuff where people are doing it as almost like a revenge thing now where they're calling in, fake police reports and SWAT teams are showing up at people's houses, and that's some scary stuff.
That's terrifying. I mean, I can't imagine being at home and not having any issues whatsoever, and all of a sudden I have a SWAT team all over my neighborhood, and they're looking at my house. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that whole SWAT thing, I mean, something's got to be done about it. I mean, you're seeing these SWAT teams coming for things that they just never would have come for in the past. I mean, misdemeanor crimes that in no way a SWAT team should be called to that house. It's just, the situation, I mean, from local police forces all the way up to DHS is getting out of control.
Well, now the militarized or the militarization of local police, that's a whole nother thing going on because, I mean, where I live in Middle Tennessee, and there's a community not too far from where I live that's only maybe, we'll say 15,000 people population. They have an MRAP. Yeah,
I think there's it's about 13,000 of them that the federal government has given to local police forces throughout the country. And the crazy thing is you are seeing towns where you got 5,000-6,000 people in this town, and they're getting $800,000 mine-resistant ambush vehicles.
Exactly.
What do they need that for? You know, I mean, they have 2 or 3 officers in the town, but they've got a vehicle that was, just in Afghanistan a month before.
Right. And I actually spoke with some people in the community where they have it, and they were like, "Yeah, well, we need that. We have all kinds of gang problems and blah blah blah." And it's like, dude, you don't have any gang problems. You got 15,000 people. You know exactly who's here. The police, if they're doing their job, know exactly where the criminal hotspots are and where the criminals are hanging out and who they are. If they're not doing their job, then they don't know that. And that's, doesn't require an MRAP.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty crazy place where we've come to. I mean, I think the fear mongering between the media and the government has convinced people that, they think their police forces need these things. And I don't get it. I mean, especially in these small rural towns, like you're saying, if there are criminals there, they know where they're at, they know who they are. And I mean, there's not gang problems in a town of 4,000 or 5,000 people. So I just don't get why these armored vehicles are going to these towns.
Yeah, and the high-powered automatic weapons and all of the, all of the support utilities that go with those items as well. I mean, it's just it's incredible. But with the situation that's going on in the Northeast right now, what would you say would be the best long-term food storage for the folks to have pre-stocked? I know they can't do anything about it right now, but like MREs or dehydrated foods or some other form of food, and why would you recommend it over other forms of food storage?
Yeah, I mean, I usually tell people to stay away from things like MREs or, even the commercial food that's out there. I mean, I've tasted a lot of these stuff, and to be honest, I'd probably rather eat dog food than a lot of the stuff that's sold. it's commercial survival food these days. I mean, some of that stuff's just horrible. Yeah, I tell people to look at what they're already eating. A survival situation is not the time where you want to start introducing new foods. So, I mean, unless you're a guy who's eating MREs, every night, I personally wouldn't use them as a survival food. I mean, you want something that how your body's going to react to it. You don't want to start getting sick from some random food that you just introduced during a situation that's already crazy to begin with.
Right.
As far as, I mean, that's the first thing I would do. I just look at what you eat and then just start stockpiling based on what you already eat.
Okay, so I mean, like canned goods and bottled water, and
yeah, I mean, you're gonna want canned goods for short-term survival. A situation like what's going on up in Buffalo right now, you're gonna want a lot of canned goods, stuff that might not require cooking. Cans of raviolis, whatever. I mean, whatever it is you eat, that's the kind of stuff you're gonna look for short-term. Long-term, you're gonna need to learn how to cook. You get a lot of people these days who can't cook something that comes out of a can. So
right.
That might be a little hard, but I mean, you've got to learn how to cook. Whether that's I've got some recommendations on my site. There's a good one called the Fanny Farmer Cookbook, and it looks at stuff that people used during the Great Depression or during war times. And it just takes these simple ingredients and starts putting together meals based on very simple stuff. A lot of these recipes came from World War II, where there was a lot of rationing. So you can take things that, if you don't have a lot in the pantry, you can do a lot with those little ingredients.
Right. And it's amazing what we can learn from the people that lived through the Great Depression. Because as you said, I mean, you had to make do with very little, and it had to go a long, long way in most cases.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's sad. It's weird. We've got the internet and we've got all this technology now. And we're supposed to be living in a time of, this great knowledge because, everything's out there. But, I mean, people are stupider than ever. It's like, I mean, you look at our, ancestors, our grandparents, how they lived, and we don't have any of that knowledge. Like I said, people can barely cook from a can, and when you look at the knowledge they had during the Great Depression, how they cooked, how they saved, we've lost a lot of that knowledge.
Well, and personally, I believe that a lot of that has been unlearned by design. that it's been removed from the knowledge base. That's just my personal feeling, but that gets into a whole nother realm as far as, people's ignorance and what's going on with our society. But if we've got a grid down situation, or even like the situation in Buffalo, say that people are snowed in for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, their short-term food is going to run out after about 4 days. If I, get some type of stove out and fire it up, and all of a sudden I've got, beef stroganoff through the neighborhood, that could attract attention that I may not want. I mean, what kind of solution would you say for that?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the disaster, that probably could become a problem. Short-term thing, it's probably not. But yeah, I mean, you see some of these longer-term disasters. I mean, people are going to get desperate. Our neighbors aren't prepared. Most of America is not. So you get down to a disaster where people are, starving or trying to figure out a way to feed their children. They're going to get desperate. So yeah, I mean, you don't want to be outside using your barbecue, having, the smell of beef going through the entire area. But I mean, there's little things. I did an article it was a couple weeks back on thermos cooking. So I mean, there are things you can do, thermos cooking, crock pots, stuff like that, where you're not going to have a lot of smell, I guess, going outside of your house.
Okay.
It uses relatively, low power. You just basically, if you can boil some water, throw some meat inside a thermos, 6-7 hours later, you got yourself a meal.
Oh, okay, that's pretty cool. So you're talking about just an everyday thermos that I could go to the local variety store and pick up.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how like Great Depression era kind of cooking, where a lot of the slow cooked meals, you can cook basically any of those things that you can cook in a crock pot. You can cook in a thermos.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay, that's pretty cool.
It sounds a little weird, and probably most people don't do it. But when I go hunting or stuff like that, I'll throw a bunch of slow cooked oats into my thermos, throw some boiling water in there. I get out there 2 hours later, that's ready to go.
Wow. Okay.
But basically any recipe that you can make in a crock pot, you can theoretically make inside a thermos. So things like rice and beans, soups, stews, chilies, that's all, you can easily cook it inside a thermos.
Okay. Not something that you want to strictly survive on, but beans and rice. I mean, if you don't have beans and rice in your pantry, then you're not doing it right, in my opinion. I mean, you gotta get with the program.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the cheapest things out there as far as if you're trying to make an emergency stockpile and you don't have a lot of money. I mean, beans and rice there isn't a heck of a lot cheaper.
No, I mean, and they store for very, very long time, and if stored properly, they will store for a long time. So,
and again, it does come back to I mean, if beans and rice aren't something that you normally eat, then you might want to look at some other things. But I mean, it definitely. I mean, in my opinion, I eat the stuff all the time, so I can't beat it.
Yeah, if you're not into beans and rice, then you might want to try rice and beans. And remind us, if you would, Rob, how much water, strictly for cooking and drinking, per person per day? What do we need to? What should I have on the shelf?
For cooking and drinking, I'd say a gallon of water per day per person. People always ask me timelines. It's hard. It's going to depend on what you're preparing for. I guess backing up a little bit is I always tell people the first place to start is doing a threat assessment. It's kind of how I start the book, and it's one of the themes throughout the book is, I think a lot of people jump into preparedness because of things they've seen on TV. Maybe they watch Doomsday Preppers and they're prepping for an asteroid or something like that to hit the Earth. Well, if that happens, you're dead.
It's not going to matter
for that. I always tell people to, make a threat assessment. It might sound simplistic, but, not all disasters are created equal. What works in one situation or, what might work for me out in my area of the country might be a totally different thing than what's going to work on the East Coast. You got to look at what threats that you're likely to face based on your area, based on things like, what disasters have hit in the past. Look at things like crime rates in your area. What's a threat that's going to face you? And then you can kind of get an idea of what kind of supplies you need, how much water you need, how much food you need.
That, in particular on the East Coast, that population density is a big, I think that's a huge threat for any type of disaster situation, whether it's man-made or natural or even something very simple, like what happened in Atlanta a couple of years ago when they had that snowstorm, and being in the South, they're completely unprepared for snow, so the city shut down. There were people that, like you said a minute ago, they don't know how to cook food out of a can, so they sure don't know how to deal with a snow situation when they don't get snow. And all of those, when you have that type of concentration of people, you're going to have people that are A, going to take advantage of the situation, and B, people that are just confused and trying to protect their children. And those are two very, very dangerous people, in my opinion.
I think it was like 2 inches of snow
that
fell. And man, people just went crazy. You had people sleeping in the Home Depot that literally just parked their car on the side of the highway and walked over to Home Depot and Walmart and slept in the store for a couple of days because they couldn't figure out how to drive home in 2 inches. Yeah. I know it's not something they normally get down there, but still, you see stuff like that happening, like people sleeping in the aisle of a CVS, and you start to get a pretty good look at what it's going to be, during a large scale disaster. It is just scary when you think about, like you said, those two types of people. It's just, you're going to see mass chaos.
Yeah, and that's as far as the threat assessment, that's where all of that came from. I think that has to be at the very top. Because most of the people that are going to be listening to this, Rob, live in very heavy populated areas. Period. That's 70% of our country. So that would mean that 70% or more of the people that listen to this are going to be directly impacted by that. So if you're not planning for that, if that's not one of the key elements of your preparedness thought process and what you're actually doing, then you need to seriously look at that. And that gets into, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that could get into a whole set of different scenarios as far as what I need to do and how I need to do it. Or am I wrong in that?
No, I think you're right. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I didn't want to write another wilderness survival manual. There's a million of those out there, and none of them, and you're right. Most people live either near or right in an urban area. Most people aren't living out in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness where they're going to need 99% of the books that are on the market right now.
Right.
Most of those skills are not going to come in handy during an urban disaster. So it was primarily the focus of my book. I didn't want to write a wilderness survival manual. I didn't want some government pamphlet on 72-hour kits or a bunch of other information that nobody's ever going to need. And I agree with you. I think people are going to be probably one of the biggest threats that most people are going to face. These high density population centers, man, if you can do something to get out of them, you need to start kind of making that plan, because you don't want to be stuck in the middle of a big city, during one of these disasters. You even look at Katrina, the kind of stuff that happened there. And it's the last place you want to be.
Yep. Well, and with Katrina, there were a couple of things, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's one of my favorite scenarios to look at, because we can learn so much from what happened. We had the total breakdown of government support, period, non-existent. Then we had the chaos that broke out from the citizens. Then immediately following that, we had the police state to step in and start going door to door, confiscating weapons. Okay, so we had three major scenarios to happen, and that's not even taking into account anything else. That's just looking at how the thing broke down and the linear steps that happened. So if you look at, okay, we've got a city that's gone, we have marauders that are taking over, and then we have police state that are trying to deal with the marauders, and in doing so, they overstep their bounds. That's ugly. That's the only way I know how to describe it. That is ugly. And if you cannot get out of the way of that, God help you.
Yeah, and it's kind of a scary situation. I mean, it's kind of surprising to me that after you see things like Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, even this recent Ebola thing, where you still have this population out there that refuses to do anything about their own personal safety. You've got a bunch of takers, and a bunch of people who are completely dependent on the government. And, they really believe they're going to be there to help them when something like that happens. But, like we've seen during Katrina, Sandy, all the recent crises, they're not going to be there. I mean, these people have no idea what they're doing.
Right.
One of the reasons, that I decided to write this book is, I've been involved in emergency preparedness for over a decade now. I've been to a lot of these, pretty high level emergency preparedness conference with some of the country's, top emergency responders, and these people don't have a clue. I've sat through some of these conferences where, people in the public would be shocked if they knew what actually goes on there. Most of these things, like these conferences, it's pretty insane. It's dedicated to things like how they're going to handle the press when they screw up, how to respond. No, I'm serious. If you look at the conference tracks, most of these things, it's like how to respond to the public via social media when things go bad. How to handle the press. It's like that's their main focus. Instead of looking at how to fix the mistakes that happened during Katrina or Sandy, these people are more interested in how to make themselves look good once they drop the ball. And it's a scary thing when you're in the middle of these conferences and realizing, okay, these are our emergency responders. These are the people who make the plans. And if the public only knew.
And their plan is, we don't have a plan.
No, they don't. I mean, look at what's happening, with the Ebola thing. I mean, these people don't have a clue.
No.
They keep playing lip service to how our hospitals are ready to respond. And, look at what happened. We had one guy show up here with Ebola, and the whole system just collapsed. I mean, I personally don't think Ebola is a huge threat at this point, but what I think is a threat is what we witnessed during the Ebola crisis. Like I said, one guy showed up here, and that was enough for everything just to break down. Think about what's going to happen if we ever have a large-scale pandemic. I mean, we couldn't handle one guy. How are they going to handle millions of people showing up in the emergency rooms?
They're not.
No, they're not. I mean, what if this Ebola thing turned out to be that pandemic? We would have been screwed.
Yeah, I mean, it would have just been good luck. We're going to have bodies in the streets. It's just going to be, it would be awful.
Yeah, I mean, listen, these guys aren't prepared to handle their own infections. By the CDC's own numbers, I think it's something like 1.7 million people that are infected every year from healthcare acquired infections. I mean, and these are things that they know about, things like MRSA and C. diff. These are things that the hospital knows about, and they can't stop infections that they deal with on a daily basis.
Good Lord.
Yeah, how are these guys coming on TV and in the same breath telling us, yeah, we're ready for Ebola, we're ready for any kind of breakout? They're not.
Well, anybody that thinks that they're living in a fantasy in the first place.
Oh, yeah. You look at, it was a couple months back, I did a report on the CDC's own handling of deadly pathogens, and I think it was something like, last year is like 86 workers have been exposed to anthrax. I mean, these guys were sending deadly strains of the avian flu through regular mail system. I mean, it's just, they can't even handle this stuff in their own labs.
Yeah, I remember that, and that was pretty telling because that was really somewhere around the height of the fear mongering for Ebola when that information came out. Just the breakdown of the CDC. I mean, they're worthless. They're not on my side. They're not here to protect us. They're not. They're just. It's like FEMA. FEMA is not here to protect us. Oh well, it'll be fine. The government's going to come in and take care of it. Just go and look on YouTube and look at the videos from the Sandy Superstorm. Look at the videos from Katrina and tell me that the government's going to come in and take care of things. They're not.
No, they're not. And the thing is, and I tell people, I talk to a lot of these first responders, and we've got a lot of good people in this country. We've got a lot of good firemen. There are good law enforcement officers out there, and there are some people in emergency preparedness that they know what they're doing. The problem comes from the upper management. I mean, these people that they put in place, they're not emergency preparedness people. They're not first responders. And a lot of these people have never dealt with disasters. I mean, you look at like during the Ebola crisis, how they put this PR guy as the Ebola czar, a guy with no medical, no emergency management experience. I mean, that's the guy that they picked to run everything. And that's how it is at every level of the government. It's not the guys that are actually out there in the field that don't know what they're doing. It's these guys that are calling the shots that are screwing everything up.
That don't know what they're doing.
No, and it's crazy because, I mean, they're all basically political lobbyists or political appointees that are getting these positions. And these guys, I mean, they've got no clue.
Well, and I want to kind of change gears just a little bit, Rob. In a grid down scenario, which seems to be always looming, just beyond sight, it's ever present. I mean, it just seems like that's a topic that comes up quite a bit. What would be one of the top 5 items that a person should consider making a substantial investment in? When I say substantial, I mean like $500 or more. If somebody's going to go out and spend $500 to help protect themselves from a grid down scenario, what would you recommend, or what would be a good alternative, or is there, or would there be a good alternative?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to come back to that threat assessment, and some of that is identifying yourself as a threat, or people in your family as a threat. And it may sound a little weird, but I mean, you got to look at things like medical conditions or weaknesses that you have, because that's going to kind of determine what you need. Everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different. But basically, I tell people to focus on kind of what I consider to be the fundamental building blocks of any good survival stockpile. That's water, food, shelter, and protection. And then if there are other problems, like first aid, medical concerns, you're going to want to take a look at that stuff. But I mean, it basically comes down to water, food, shelter, and protection. If you can cover those 4 things, you're going to be ahead of about 99% of Americans.
Okay. So how would you define short-term and long-term?
Short-term is going to be about 2 to 3 weeks, probably.
Okay.
There's a lot of this stuff out there about, you see all these government suggestions of the 72-hour bag, and you see a lot of these websites pop up with that. Personally, I hate those 72-hour bags. It's just one of those pieces of advice that just really bugs me. It's almost like it's become like gospel for some reason. You got to have the 72-hour bag. But I just think it kind of sets people up for disaster, and it just grossly underestimates the amount of time that they should be preparing for. Yeah, we were talking a little bit about Hurricane Sandy or Katrina. That went a heck of a lot longer than 72 hours. You had some of these people that were without power for months.
Yep.
So, I mean, what's a 72-hour bag going to do at that point for them? Not a whole hell of a lot.
Well, I mean, a 72-hour bag, that's what most people call their pantry, because that's about how much food that they have in their house at any given moment is about 3 or 4 days. And that's about it.
You're right. And that's scary because you look at the average household, and I think it is. I think that they say about 3 to 4 days is what the average person has. And you see it during the I've been watching some of this news coverage up from Buffalo, and it's just person after person talking about how they only have a day or two worth of food in their home. And you're just thinking, it's like, how? Yeah, I mean, this lake effect snow up there, it's not something new.
Right.
You know? I mean, they've gone through this before. How do you have only 1 or 2 days worth of food in the winter? It's mind boggling.
It really is. Well, I mean, and that goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago as far as, people's intelligence levels and how they've dropped off. I mean, how can you be looking at, Lake Superior or whichever one that it is that's blowing into Buffalo, I don't know, we'll say every winter and not have more than, 2 days worth of food in your house? How could that even be something that's acceptable within your own mind? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know.
I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, you see the same thing on the East Coast where people, year after year, they get hit with these hurricanes, and it's the same kind of thing. You watch the news and same thing. You see everybody run into the store to buy that water that they need, and it's crazy. I mean,
Yes.
It's not like these, and that's a scary thing. I think when you start thinking, when you go from short-term disasters to long-term disasters, I mean, you see how 90% of this country deals with the short-term disaster, most of which they know is coming. Now imagine something long-term, and I mean, that's where you start to get into some scary situations.
Yes, and that's why I was kind of asking about, your definition of short term and versus long term. I mean, if you're thinking, if your thought is that 3 weeks would be short term, then anything beyond that would be, you would consider more long term.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the disaster, but yeah, I mean, long term can be anywhere from, I mean, even for during Sandy, some of those I would consider long term, and there was people without power for a couple months.
Yes.
I mean, at that point, 2 or 3 weeks in, you think some of these people would have come up with a plan B, but I guess that wasn't even enough. But yeah, I mean, a long-term disaster, I would consider anything over a month.
Okay. And I appreciate you taking time out to talk to me this morning. I really do. It means a lot.
I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate what you're doing over there. It's always good to see people who have these kind of different expertise. Yeah, I'm not a big expert on gold and silver, so I appreciate a lot of your podcasts and a lot of what you talk about over there. It's definitely taught me a lot, and I love stuff like this. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I tell people: start listening to these people out there that are experts in their fields.
Yes. Thanks, Rob, and we've been talking to Rob Richardson of Off Grid Survival this morning. So offgridsurvival.com. And Rob, why don't you tell people about your new book and your website?
Yeah, thanks, Rory. Just real quick, I guess the new book is The Ultimate Situational Survival Guide, Self-Reliant Strategies for a Dangerous World. Like I said earlier, this isn't your typical wilderness survival book. It's not some government pamphlet on 72-hour bags. This is, I think, kind of a fresh approach to real survival issues that everybody's going to face in the 21st century. The website's offgridsurvival.com. Talk about a lot of the same issues there. Get into some alternative news stuff that the mainstream media really doesn't cover. And again, I just want to thank you for your time today, and thank you for having me on.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate all your time and all your knowledge, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to do this again in the future.
Thanks, Rory.
Thank you.